Okay, so we're going to start now to talk about burden of proof. Let's review. When you have a criminal trial, you have a prosecutor and you have a defense attorney. The job of the prosecutor is to show that the defendant is guilty. The job of the defense attorney is to show that the prosecutor has failed to show he's guilty. Not the defense attorney has to show he's innocent, just that he's failed to show that he's guilty. So the prosecutor has a big job. To show that he's guilty, let's say, would mean to present enough evidence that it's very likely that he's guilty. Let's say 80% probability. All the defense attorney has to do is say, you only presented 79%. Sorry, no sale. 79% is a lot. It's more than 3/4. If someone had to bet, is he innocent or guilty, he'd bet that he's guilty, but it's not enough to convict. Convict, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. 20% is a reasonable doubt. It's already a reasonable doubt. So the responsibility of the prosecutor is a big responsibility. The responsibility of the defense attorney is a very small responsibility. There's an asymmetry. Because you're trying to convict him of a crime, trying to convince that it's very likely to be true. In a civil case, it's not like that at all. Civil case is a preponderance of the evidence. That's 50% plus epsilon, plus something. Just a little over the middle line. If you can show that it's 50% plus that he's guilty, they have to pay. And if it's not 50% plus or something, then they won't have to pay. That's how I told you O.J. Simpson could escape the criminal trial and yet lose in the civil trial, where they're suing for damages. And it could be that this is the reason in a criminal trial, when you ask the jury what their decision is, what do they say? Either guilty or not guilty. They don't say innocent. Why not? It's shorter. Innocent is one word. Not guilty is two words. Because they're not deciding that he's innocent. They're deciding that no adequate case was made that he's guilty. That's all. So in a typical case, if the defense attorney wins, no one knows anything at the end. He might still be guilty, for all we know. It might even be very probable that he's guilty, 75%. It's just not 80%, where it will be convicting. Now, you have the same difference if you're discussing an issue that you want to settle, whether it's true or false, whether it should be accepted or shouldn't be accepted. Proposition Q, and somebody says, I believe in Q. Q is true. Q is a fact. And I say, I don't know. I haven't studied it. I haven't been there. So I'm open-minded. You present to me your reasons for thinking that Q is true. How much must he do to get me to accept it? Well, not 50% plus one thing. That's not enough for me to accept something is true. I'd rather say I'm in doubt. 50% plus one. I need more than that to convince me that it's true. Let's say that my standard is 80%. To show me that it's quite probable, really quite probable, 4 out of 5, that it's true. Then I'll accept that it's true. Less than that, I won't. Okay, so now he's trying to convince me that I should accept it. Now he's presenting his evidence. He's piling it up. And the probability is going up and up and up. What am I doing? Well, I'm trying to figure out, should I give in to him and accept Q or not? So as he's piling up the evidence, the probability is going up, 60, 65, 70, 75. I'm waiting to see whether he gets to 80. Now he gets up to 80 and I say, yeah, but this piece of evidence isn't true. No, you can't use that one, so it's back down to 75. Well, then I'm not going to accept what he says. Not because I know he's wrong. I don't know he's wrong. Indeed, might be more probable that he's right, but it's not enough for me to change my mind. It's not enough for me to make up my mind. So, my job in defending myself and preserving my ignorance is much easier than his job in trying to convince me. He's got to get to 80%. If he's at 79%, I'm not going to change my mind. If this is a debate between two people about Q, and they start off, one says Q is true and the other says Q is false, my suggestion is let one of them agree to bear the burden of burden of proof. Let him shoot for the 80%, and let the other guy just take the easy job of pulling him down to 79. After that's finished, either he made it to 80%, in which case we should now all agree that it's true, or he didn't make it, in which case we should not agree it's true, and maybe not agree that it's false, and just remain in our state of ignorance. Then you go to the other guy. You say it's not true. Let's hear you get to 80% that it's not true. See if you can make it, and we'll see whether we can stop you at 79. It's very possible that you could stop both of them at 79. In which case, the end of the discussion will be, we don't know whether it's true or false. And that's a very good place to be, because it's often quite correct that you don't know whether it's true or false. You haven't got enough information, you haven't got enough logic, you haven't done enough investigation, you haven't compared it with other people's views. Now, if you don't pay attention to who has the burden of proof, and you slip over to shifting the burden of proof, then you get observed results. So let me give you some examples of the observed results so you'll see how it works. Let's take an actual court case. Philip is accused of committing murder. So we know where and when the murder took place. And the defense attorney produces a witness who says that at the time of the murder, Philip was 200 miles away. Gee, that's bad for the prosecution, right? He wasn't there, he was 200 miles away. Prosecutor said, listen, given where you say he was, if he had a helicopter, he could have made it. Because from there to where the murder was only 2 minutes by helicopter. And your watch and his watch and their watches in the town aren't that accurate. So you haven't proved he didn't do it, he still could have done it. Do you hear how the thing's going off the rails? When the prosecutor says he could have had a helicopter, should we now put him in jail for murder? Because he could have had a helicopter? Surely not. The prosecutor would have to show that he did have a helicopter, not that he could have had a helicopter. The goal of the discussion is not to prove that he's innocent. The goal of the discussion is to prove that he's guilty. If he's 100 miles away at the time of the event, then there's very good reason to think that he didn't do it. And that it's still possible that he did it isn't a reason to think that he did it. It's a reason to think he's possible. But possibility isn't enough. You don't convict somebody on the grounds that he could have done the murder. You have to convict him on the grounds that he did do the murder. So you have to be very careful who has the burden of proof, and is he providing you with the evidence that's necessary to get to the conclusion that he's met that burden and he should be accepted. I'll give you a real life case from evolutionary biology. This was very famous in the 70s and then became more elaborated, more technical. But here's the general idea. If you dig down and look at the fossils, what you find, even till today, you find that if a certain, let's say, species, and as you go down, the species stays the same, could stay the same for 1 million years, and then you come to a new stratum where there's something there that is similar to that species you've been studying, but considerably different. In other words, there aren't smooth changes, smooth little changes. On the contrary, what was called punctuated equilibria. There's equilibrium, it's the same, and then there's a punctuation where a sizable change took place. Well, that's not what Darwin predicts. Darwin says changes have to be small changes. One reason is because you make a big change, if something as complicated as a human being or a squirrel or a tree, it's going to die. These things are very complicated. They have very complex functions that require the dovetailing of different elements in certain proportions. If you make a big change, it's not going to survive. They'll tell you about the giraffe. The giraffe was going after the leaves on the trees, and by growing a longer neck, it could get to the leaves that other animals couldn't get, and that's why it had an advantage, right? The whole story is wrong. But just stop and think about this for a moment. You grow a longer neck. And a giraffe neck is quite long, right? Well, is the heart strong enough to pump blood to the brain? That could be a problem, right? Because no blood to the brain isn't good for survival, isn't good for reproduction. So the heart better get stronger at the same time. And then you have blood vessels carrying the blood up. But now, if the heart pumps and then stops to take in more blood, and you've got a column that's 10 feet tall of blood, at the moment when it's not pumping, it's going to slosh back down. Oh, so you have phalanges that when it's not pumping, they stand out and they hold the blood where it is, and then when the new blood goes up, they go to the side and let more blood go up. So you better have that also. Now, wait a minute. What about balance? The organs of balance are in your head. Well, how do you keep track of balancing your body when your head is now 10 feet higher than your body? Maybe you're just going to keel over because you can't keep your balance. Better change the balance organs also, because otherwise it's not going to work. Well, there are a lot of different things that have to change to make it work. And they have to change in coordination with one another. Maybe it's gradual, but all of them have to gradually work. So you're talking about massive changes, and you're supposed to see that each change is only a small change. Because if you have, let's say, a change in the neck, which isn't accompanied by a change in the heart, so then it doesn't work. So the question on Darwin was, you see the same thing for a million years, and then you see something that's considerably different. How did you get from one to the other? You couldn't have gotten there, according to Darwinism, by just changing it into the bigger one, because that change would have killed it. So they came up, Gould, Eldridge, Stephen J. Gould, and Eldridge's the first name, wrote a joint paper, and I think it was 1974, called Punctuated Equilibria. And here's the theory. Now, again, later it became more complicated. If you ask aficionados, they'll tell you. Here's the theory. You're right. When you go down and look at the fossils, you get a million years of one thing, and then you get a considerably different thing below it. That's because when you have a large, connected population, changes don't happen. They get diluted in the large population. If a few individuals get changes, but then they mate with others in the large population, and then the changes get diluted and the changes don't happen. Changes take place in small, isolated populations. So, let's say in Central Africa you have the wildebeest. 15 million wildebeest. Those are like deer or something. Now, they're on the plains for 1,000 miles. Big, coordinated population. And then in one area, there's a tremendous storm lasting 3 days, and it's lightning and thunder, and the wildebeest are running in all directions. And there happens to be a range of medium-sized mountains with passes between the mountains, and about 500 wildebeest run over a low pass into a valley in the middle of this storm. After 3 days, the storm abates and the clouds disappear, and these wildebeest are in the valley. They don't remember how they got there, and they don't know how to get out. They're stuck. 500 of them, some males and some females. And there's only enough food in the valley to support 500 wildebeest. If they multiply and have too many offspring, they'll just die of starvation. So now you have something that's going to keep it at 500. Well, a small isolated population can propagate changes throughout the entire population relatively quickly. Let's take 200,000 years, okay? That's long enough, to get a soda. And the hooves get a little sharper, and the muscles for running get sturdier, and the balance gets better, and the perception gets better. And these wildebeest are improving in the valley for 200,000 years. And now there's an earthquake, and the earthquake crumbles the piece of mountain that protects the valley, and now the valley is connected to the plains. And out of the valley come the new improved wildebeest with the sharper hooves and the faster running and the better perception. And as they spread out over the plains, since they are now better at reproducing, they take over the whole plains with the new model. So when you are doing paleontology, when you're digging for fossils, you're not going to find that little valley. That little valley is 1% of the geography. You're going to find the plains. What are you going to find in the plains? Well, first you're going to find the new improved version for 1 million years. And before that, you're going to find the older version with nothing in between, because all the small changes took place in that hidden valley. Now, what do we do with this idea about the hidden valley? We didn't find the hidden valley. So what is the believer in evolution going to use this idea for? Suppose he says, look, you asked me, where's the missing evidence? You asked me, how come there aren't small changes in the fossil record? I'm explaining it to you. The reason they aren't in the fossil record is because you didn't find them in the fossil record. They really are there in that little valley, and you didn't find that valley. So Darwin is right all along. It always takes place in small changes. You just don't see it because you didn't find that valley. Has he saved the positive argument for Darwin? Has he now filled the gap? Should I now say, oh, now I see that Darwin is right? Absolutely not. Because he didn't show me the valley. All he said is that there might have been such a valley. And since there might have been such a valley, Darwin's description might still be correct. But we weren't discussing whether it might be correct. We weren't discussing whether it's possible that it's true. We're discussing whether there's enough evidence to say that it is true. That's not the same. That's like the prosecutor saying, well, he could have had a helicopter, so we have to put him in jail for being a murderer. No, could have had a helicopter isn't good enough. Got to show me the helicopter. So here too, if you want to convince me that Darwin is right, it's not enough to say, if there's such a valley, then in fact Darwin could still be right. We weren't discussing whether he could be right. We're discussing whether there's enough evidence to decide that he is right. And this doesn't do the job. So I think this is an example of where the shifting of the burden of proof, where when he touts this little valley theory, he says, so I've defended Darwin. No, you haven't. What you've really done is said to the other guy, prove he's wrong, and you've shown that he hasn't proved he's wrong. He wasn't supposed to prove he's wrong. You were supposed to prove he's right, and you didn't do that. The same thing happened in even simpler form. Darwin himself said, when he published Origin of Species in 1865, he said, anyone who trusts the current fossil record should reject my theory. Because I say there have to be small, gradual changes, and the fossil record definitely doesn't show it. So, how did he respond to that objection? He said, the fossil record as we have it is very incomplete. We haven't dug up many fossils, and some types of organisms in their environments don't leave fossils because they dissolve entirely, so therefore it's going to be incomplete. In that respect, the fossil record is itself incomplete, and therefore it's not an objection against my theory that it's incomplete. So Stephen Stanley, who was an evolutionist at Johns Hopkins, wrote a book on the subject, and he said Darwin abandoned his logic, his empiricism, because he's facing an objection. The evidence is missing, and he's not filling in the evidence. Oh, you didn't look at Idaho. Look at the fossils in Idaho. They're all there. I'm right. Gradual changes. Fossils in Beijing. You have to look at all the evidence. No, he didn't say that. What he said is, I'll explain to you why you don't have the evidence. You don't have the evidence because you didn't look enough. Well, maybe yes and maybe no. Maybe the reason we don't have the evidence is because, dare I suggest this, because his theory is wrong? Maybe that's why we don't have the evidence? Because there isn't any evidence, and the theory in fact is a mistake? He hasn't shown that that's incorrect. So, as Stephen Stanley says, Darwin abandoned his commitment to empiricism. Empiricism means do observations, collect data, and draw conclusions. And here he acknowledges the data isn't there, and he still wants to support his conclusion on the grounds that we haven't found all the evidence yet. Well, you don't know that that's true. You don't know that that's true. Might not be. In the meantime, the record that you have is missing, and since the record that you have is missing, there's no reason whatsoever for me to roll over and agree that it's true, that Darwin's theory is true. This is the way this works in science. We together so far? We had this also when we're talking about ethics. If I say that there are, the critic says there are no standards, particularly no standards in ethics, and I ask him, why do you think that? Why are you convinced that there are no standards? Very often what you'll get back is, you show me the standards. I challenge you. You show me the standards. You can show them to me, I'll agree with you. Otherwise, you're wrong. You shouldn't accept that challenge. Because what he's asking you to do is to prove that you're right. That wasn't the game. The game was to listen to him and see if he can prove that he's right. He shifts the burden to you because he can't meet it on his own. He can't argue that there aren't any standards. How's he going to do that? We talked about that. So you got to be very careful not to allow him to push you into a corner and say, where are the standards? You show them to me. At that point, you should throw the red flag of a foul down and say, no. You were supposed to give me your reason for thinking there are no standards. The fact that I can't show them to you that's not a reason to think there aren't any, unless you think I'm God. And that's a compliment, I suppose, that if I can't show it to you, it can't exist because I'm God. But I don't look at myself that way. The fact that I can't show it to you leaves it as an open question. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. So that's another case where who has to prove what is very crucial to settle at the outset. Now, there's another application of this idea, which is, I'd say, fairly common. Let's say we're talking about the existence of God. So you have a believer and an atheist. And my suggestion was that one of them should bear the burden of proof, and the other will just see how good his proof is. So I asked the atheist, are you willing to bear the burden of proof? And he says, no, it's wrong to ask me to bear the burden of proof at all. Not first, not second, and not 10th. Why? Why is that? Because we're talking about whether or not something exists. And when you're talking about something exists, the default position is that it doesn't exist. Only the one who says it does exist has to argue that it does exist. Otherwise, if there's no argument, good evidence, proof that it exists, the default position is that it doesn't exist. Now, I don't know, some people seem to hear something in this, or they sort of convinced by this. Yeah, I guess he's saying it is, so he has to show me that it is. And if he can't show me that it is, then it isn't. But this is the same mistake. Anybody who takes a position and says that so-and-so are the facts should give a reason why he says so-and-so are the facts. Makes no difference whether the fact he believes in is that such and such exists, or whether the fact he believes in that such and such doesn't exist. If neither side could provide good reason, you shouldn't say, therefore we conclude that it doesn't exist. What you should say is, therefore we don't know whether it exists or not. The fact that one's saying it does exist, the other says it doesn't exist, doesn't settle the issue. Let's take, for example, a conspiracy. Is there a conspiracy or not? There are conspiracies. They do exist. They do happen. And he's saying this and this phenomenon is because of a conspiracy. And other people say, no, there's no conspiracy, it's just natural. Happened by accident. So now we ask, you believe it's a conspiracy? Show me your evidence. You believe it's not a conspiracy? Show me your evidence. And the second guy says, no. When I say it's not a conspiracy, all I have to do is see whether he can show that it is. If he shows that it is, I'll give up. If not, I win. No, you don't. You don't win. Why do you win? You say there's not a conspiracy, and you haven't given any reason to think there isn't a conspiracy. So, why should you win? If you take a position, you ought to defend the position with some kind of reason. So when it comes to the existence of God, this becomes very, very important. Believers present reasons for thinking God exists, and atheists, at the beginning, play the game the way they ought. They attack the reasons and say the reasons aren't good, or aren't good enough. You didn't get to 80%, it's not good enough to convince me that God exists. But then, when they finish that leg of the argument, and let's say the believer says, I thought my reasons were stronger. I see now that you're right, they're weaker than I thought. And really, I can't present good enough reasons to convince you that God exists. And the atheist then says, so I'm right, there is no God. Sorry. No, you're not. All you are now is like the erstwhile believer that you don't know whether there is or there isn't. To conclude that there isn't a God, you'd have to have positive reason to 80% that there isn't a God. Not just you didn't prove there is. So let me take a couple of simple, everyday circumstances which might make this illustrate this. There's a murderer who's running from the police, and they see him run behind a row of houses, and they don't see him run out from the row of houses. Well, he's probably hiding in one of the houses. One of the houses. What about this house? There's 6 houses there. Do I have any good reason to think that he's in this house? No. So should I conclude he's not in that house? I don't think so. He's a murderer after all. If he's in that house and I walk in, I could be in serious trouble. What I should say is, I haven't got enough evidence to conclude that he's in any of the houses, so I should be worried about all the houses. I don't simply say that because now we're talking about a negative, that he's not in the house, that one wins. Let's take a batch of food, and it's supposed to be prepared in a germ-free environment, and there was a break in the germ wall. Did it get to the food, or didn't it get to the food? Not clear. The food has been shipped off to China, and we found out that the break in the wall took place 2 weeks ago. What should we do about it? So this fellow who I'm fighting with says, look, do you have evidence that there's germs in the food? No. Well, the default position then is that it's pure. Don't bother. Don't worry. Absolutely not. There was a break in the wall. Maybe there are germs in the food. Indeed, perhaps we should simply recall the entire shipment on the grounds that maybe it's contaminated. So don't let anybody short-circuit the discussion by saying all the burden of proof is on you to prove that there is a God. And if you fail, then I'm perfectly justified in being an atheist. That's not true. To be justified in being an atheist, you've got to give positive reason that there isn't a God. If you can't do that, then what you really ought to be is what's called an agnostic, who's someone who admits his ignorance and says, I don't know whether there is a God or isn't a God. And it might make a big difference, because if you're really in doubt, and you think, well, look, there are two possibilities. Either there is or there isn't. And if there is, that's a big fact, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't it change the way you look at the world, the way you make your choices, priorities, the way you acknowledge your responsibilities, if God exists, and you don't know that he doesn't? So one might suggest maybe you should play it safe. Keep Shabbos, because if you end up being surprised 37 years from now that there is a God who said to keep Shabbos at Sinai, you'll be very happy that you kept Shabbos. I mean, that has to be taken seriously. If you dismiss on the grounds that no one's proved God exists, if you just dismiss it and say, therefore, it's okay to be an atheist, you don't take into account the two possibilities. Same thing's true with respect to ethics being objective. There's a lot of discussion of this. There are differences of opinion on both sides. And here too, you'll hear people say, prove to me it's objective, and if you don't prove to me it's objective, then it's relative. And that's the same mistake. If I don't prove that it's objective, then you have no reason to say it's objective. But you also may have no reason to say it's relative either. You might have reason to do something very un-Jewish, that is, just keep quiet, because you don't know either of them, and then just confess your ignorance. And here too, it might make a big difference. Let's suppose you've read the arguments on both sides and you don't know which one is right. You don't know which way to go. Well, if you're honest and you say, there are those who say it is objective, and if it is objective, then what I'm doing is wrong, maybe I should play it safe. Because if it turns out that they're correct, I'm going to be very, very upset with myself that I did these things that are evil. So maybe I should play it safe and live up to the rules of morality, even though at the present time there's no proof that it really is objective. Whereas if you have this false move of saying, if you don't prove it's right, then I'm allowed to assume it's wrong, you won't take that precaution. So this is the way in which I think all these discussions and issues should be attacked. Now, when you're having a discussion with someone, especially when it's a discussion about religion in general or Yiddishkeit in particular, but I would say this even across the board when it's some other topic, the best position for you to be in is to let him take the burden of proof first. And I'll tell you why. First of all, when it comes to Yiddishkeit, the other guy's always sure he's right. He's sure. Science says so, philosophy says so, politics says so, you're definitely wrong. I know you're wrong. So that's good. He's taking a very strong position. So you say to him, aha, you're sure I'm wrong, you're sure you've got the truth, so you should be able to explain what your reason is and show me that it's very high probability that you're correct. I'm willing to hear you. And challenge him. And he, because of his self-confidence, usually takes the bait. Says, sure, I'll show you. Not difficult. There's Darwin, there's Age of the Universe, there's dinosaurs, trots out all the normal stuff. And then you start to raise questions about his argument, raise questions about his evidence, and one by one begins to see, well, that one's not going to really work, and that was not really going to convince, so I can't really use that one. And one thing he learns is a little humility. In particular, if you represent the Torah point of view, he learns double humility. Number one, that he got things wrong, and that someone who believes in the Torah knows enough to show him that he got things wrong, which wasn't supposed to happen. Because if you wear a hat like this, you're supposed to be living in the Middle Ages, and an IQ of 72, and inability to think straighter than a puddle. So you create a little respect. And if you succeed in reducing his arguments, And then you point out to him as a matter of logic. So at this point, you should at least admit you don't know you're right, and it's possible that I'm right. You're not going to make the mistake of saying, therefore I am right. And he admits that you've achieved a very important goal. He now is much more open-minded than he was. He thought for sure that what he's doing is right. And now, I couldn't really defend it, so maybe not so. Number one, and since you're the one who pointed out to him, you get a certain amount of credibility. And now when you come to present your case, he may listen to you with much more fairness, openness, and objectivity than otherwise. Because if you start, and he has this deep-seated prejudice that you're an ignoramus with an IQ of 70, he won't really listen to you. He won't take you seriously. So I always like to put the burden of proof on the other guy first, especially if it's science or philosophy or politics or ethics or whatever it is, and show him that there are holes in his position, and then hopefully I can get to a position where I can present my arguments in favor of my position. We together so far? So I want to make one more distinction that's crucial here. Suppose someone raises an objection against the Torah. In principle, there are two different ways to respond, and in certain selected cases, there aren't two ways to respond. There's only one, and that changes the dialogue considerably. He says, you believe that women are inferior to men. So one thing to say is, no, we don't. Why do you think that? Where do you take that from? What's your evidence that we think is that they're inferior to men? Well, you have different roles for men and women. Yeah, we do have different roles for men and women. But why does that make one superior and one inferior? If you have, let's say, in your armed forces, the commander of a submarine and the commander of a tank battalion, they're not doing the same thing. Would you say that one is definitely superior or inferior to the other one? I don't know. I don't know why you would do that. He's doing a submarine and he's doing tanks. They're both necessary. They both play a role in the battles. The fact that it's different doesn't mean one is superior and one is inferior. And, in fact, if you ask, according to our point of view, what makes a life successful? So there are two outstanding criteria. One is prophecy. Prophecy is the highest spiritual attainment a human being can achieve. And according to our sources, there were post-Sinai 1,200,000 prophets, 600,000 men, 600,000 women. So it sounds like prophecy is equally available to both men and women. And if that's the highest possible spiritual achievement, it doesn't sound like women are being put in an inferior position. Another sign of spiritual achievement is misas neshika, death by a kiss, death by a divine kiss. And the tradition says that when it describes when a person dies al pi Hashem, which normally would be understood to mean through God's word, but it is for Moses and Aaron interpreted to mean by a divine kiss. And the oral tradition tells us that Miriam died in the same way. So you have the three siblings, and each one of them died with a divine kiss. Two are men and one is a woman. So it doesn't seem like women are deprived of the opportunity to achieve the highest levels of spiritual success. So you're telling me that we treat men as superior to women? Show me in our sources that that's so. It's that's not so. Now, his backup is, well, listen, I come from Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, we have certain things we want to accomplish in life. And your system of life doesn't allow a man from Los Angeles, or doesn't allow a woman from Los Angeles to accomplish as much as a man from Los Angeles wants to accomplish. So your system is biased in that it deprives women from Los Angeles from achieving as much in terms of Los Angeles values as men from Los Angeles can achieve their Los Angeles values. So the answer to that is this is apples and oranges. The Torah system was designed to enable people to achieve the Torah's values. The Torah's system of life wasn't designed to achieve Los Angeles values. If you say to me that living a Torah lifestyle will cripple you in achieving Los Angeles values, I'll applaud. I think that's a good outcome. You shouldn't be trying to achieve Los Angeles values. Is that prejudice? You bet. You bet. But of course, it's based on logic as well, if you care to study the logic. So the idea of its being inferior, something which I can argue from the inside, and I can also argue from the outside. So I can, number one, say that you're raising the question is raising it in a way that's incompetent, because you're interested in the Torah fulfilling Los Angeles values. That's just not a competent project. And if you're talking about the Torah's values, you're making a mistake of what the Torah values say. There are cases where you can't use a double approach. I'll give you an example. What's today? Today's Monday. So you'll think about this example. We'll talk about it again tomorrow, because this is a case that's, for some people, difficult to digest. But according to strict Torah law, if a non-Jew's life is in danger on Shabbos, you're not allowed to violate Shabbos to save his life. But if a Jew's life is in danger on Shabbos, you are allowed to violate Shabbos to save his life. And, oh boy, that's a tough one. Try to sell that in the New York Times or on CNN. They're not going to hear it. They're going to say that shows that your system doesn't have justice, doesn't have fairness, doesn't have equality, and therefore it's a bad system. Well, the only response I know to this is what I heard from Rabbi Yaakov Rosenberg, one of the founders of Ohr Somayach. And he said like this: you're looking at the world, you the critic, the external critic, you're looking at the world from a certain lens, with certain assumptions. And you're drawing a conclusion. I'm looking at the world with a different lens. I'm drawing a different conclusion. I think I can show you that if you were to adopt my lens, you would agree with my conclusion. And that being the case, the real disagreement between us isn't this particular law. The disagreement between us is what lens we use to look at the world at. And then the question will be, can you show that your lens is correct and my lens is incorrect? And if you can't, then your critique no longer has a foundation. So, in capsule form, here's how it works. The critic looks at the world, he's an atheist. Of course, there's no divine providence. Many things happen by accident. Many things happen for no particular purpose. He believes that life has value, particularly human life has value, and that other things being equal, if to not too great a cost, you could save a human life, it's an obligation to do so. And he says, you people, you religious Jews, you won't violate your Sabbath laws to save a life. Sabbath is a holiday, and it has a certain spiritual value and psychological value, and a tradition, so on and so on, but you can't compare that with saving a life. So if you won't violate your holiday laws to save a life, your position is immoral. Fine. That's the way it looks to the critic, because of where he starts from. Now let me explain, this is Rabbi Rosenberg's idea, let me explain how it looks to us. First of all, let's ask, people die. Why do they die? What causes the death? What's behind the death? From our point of view, there's divine providence, and divine providence decides life and death. So if a person dies, let's leave murder out of the picture. Let's just talk about what we would call natural death. Heart attacks, falling off a mountain, bitten by a snake. eating poisonous food. That's a divine decision that his life is over, that it shouldn't continue. Now, from our point of view, God gives life continuously. It isn't that you're alive because you're born and nobody killed you yet. It's that God gives life moment by moment. Life is a free gift. So when God says, this is the end of your life, he's not violating any moral rules by doing so. He's simply saying, I gave you so and so many years of free life, and I'm not giving you any more free life. You have no claim on more free life. So if God decides that a person's life is over, then it's over. And there's no more complaint about that. Okay, now, let's compare two cases. Case number one, the non-Jew is drowning in the lake and there's nobody there. Nobody. He's in utter isolation. And he drowns and dies. Why did he die? Because the creator of the universe decided that that should be the end of his life. Okay, case number two, the non-Jew is drowning in the lake and there's a Jew there, and God says to the Jew, don't save him. What's the outcome? God is saying, I want him to die. I want this to be the end of his life. What difference does it make whether God arranges it that he should drown with nobody there, or God arranges it that he should drown and the Jew is standing there and God tells the Jew not to save him? In both cases, divine providence is determining that this should be the end of his life, and divine providence is within its moral authority to determine something like that. So I say to the critic, I think you should be able to see that if you adopted my lens, if you looked at the world in terms of divine providence, there wouldn't be any objection to a law, don't break Shabbos to save a non-Jew. Because it's not an accident the non-Jew is dying. Not a happenstance. It isn't random. It's all divine providence. But you don't believe in divine providence. I understand you. You think the world is happenstance. There's nobody in charge. Many things happen by accident with no particular control or no particular direction. I understand that. So now, you have your lens. In terms of your lens, my reluctance to, my unwillingness to violate Shabbos to save a non-Jew's life is a moral crime. I agree with you. From the point of view of that lens, it's definitely a moral crime. And I say, if you adopt my lens, it's not a moral crime. So you and I don't disagree about saving lives. You and I disagree about what lens you should use to look at the world with. So now I say to you, Sir Critic, who you're attacking me as having an immoral system, can you show that my lens is incorrect? Can you show, this is back to word burden of proof, can you show that there's no divine providence? I think you're going to find that very difficult. So it comes out then that you have your assumption and I have my assumption. On your assumption you get your outcome, on my assumption I get my outcome. Why then do you think that you have a critique of me? I believe I have more than that. I wrote a book called Reason to Believe. I think we have enough reason to believe that our lens is correct. But even without that, the critic here, I think, is neutralized, to use a word that's popular in the current jargon nowadays. His critique is neutralized because it turns out that it depends upon an assumption that he's making, which doesn't have to be made. I think that's an important type of question, as against questions where I can say to him that even in your own terms you're making a mistake, like with men and women, it's apple and oranges. Los Angeles values have nothing to do with what the Torah is about. Here, it's not that he's making a mistake in his own terms, but he's making a mistake in relying on his own terms and not taking into account that I have my terms, and the terms have equal claim to credibility. Okay? These are just examples of how argumentation should take place. So maybe tomorrow, Mr. Hashem, I'll go back over some of these issues because there's a few issues that we talked about today, and then we'll go on.